Hey guys, welcome back. Or maybe you just needed a change of pace from all that messy French republicanism. Either way, the lights are low, the world is quiet, and we are going to gently float down into the beautiful, chaotic, and often extremely petty world of Renaissance Italy. Tonight's topic is the Renaissance. Now, that sounds like it should be full of excitement, genius artists, dramatic sculpture, great philosophy, and all that. But don't worry, we're going to slow it right down. We're going to look at the money, the infighting, the spectacularly bad decisions, and the crippling insecurity that actually funded this whole rebirth thing. We're focusing on the people who paid the bills, and boy were they weird. Let's travel back to the early 15th century and settle right into the heart of it all, the totally unregulated, cutthroat, and unbelievably rich city of Florence. The Medici, bankers, not princes, yet. If you want to understand the Italian Renaissance, you have to understand the Medici family. They are the main characters of our sleepy, low-stakes Italian drama. They didn't start as warrior kings or ancient nobles. They started as, and fundamentally remained, bankers. Now, banking in 15th century Florence was not the staid, boring affair it is today. It was competitive, it was dangerous, and it was deeply complicated by the fact that the Catholic Church, officially, considered lending money for interest, usury, to be a sin. The Medici had to be extremely creative with their accounting to both be good Catholics and the richest family in Europe. The family's rise to true power starts with a man named Giovanni de' Medici. Giovanni was a shrewd, quiet man who was good with numbers, and even better at being politically invisible. He understood that true power lay not in fancy titles or marching around in armor, but in cash flow. His genius move? The Medici Bank became the primary financial institution for the papacy. Think about that for a second. The Church, which ruled over much of Europe, had vast revenues from tithes, fees, and all sorts of other dubious sources, and all that money flowed through the Medici Bank. This gave the Medici two huge advantages. Unlimited capital, they suddenly had access to the largest, most reliable revenue stream in Europe, and political immunity. You don't mess with the bank that holds the Pope's money. It meant that while other merchant families were constantly being targeted and exiled, the Medici were essentially untouchable. Giovanni was famously anti-pomp. He insisted on dressing like a regular Florentine merchant. He told his family, don't attract attention. He taught them that the best way to rule a republic was to pretend you weren't ruling it at all. Cosimo the Elder, the quiet puppet master. Giovanni's son, Cosimo de' Medici, known as Cosimo the Elder, inherited this massive financial machine in 1429. Cosimo was the man who truly perfected the art of invisible political control. He was a large, quiet, intellectual man who loved ancient Greek philosophy and collecting manuscripts. But he was also completely ruthless. He understood that in a republic like Florence, the rules were designed to keep one person from taking absolute control. So he didn't try to become the duke or prince. He just made sure he controlled all the people who were the duke or prince. He ruled by being the patron. If you were a successful painter, Cosimo paid you. If you were a promising young scholar, Cosimo funded your studies. If you were an ambitious politician, Cosimo lent you money and then made sure you got a seat on the ruling council. This meant that every successful person in Florence, every beautiful piece of art, and every major political decision felt indebted to Cosimo. He was the city's single, irreplaceable gravity well. Cosimo himself summed up his political philosophy with a wonderful piece of dry, self-aware snark. 50 years are enough to ask one's country to live in one's own manner. Translation: I've been funding this place for decades, so now you all just do what I want. His one big crisis came early. In 1433, the other major banking families, the Albizzi, who were terrified of Cosimo's power, managed to have him briefly arrested and exiled. But this only proved Cosimo's strength. When he left, the economy of Florence instantly cratered. The entire city panicked. After just 1 year, the Florentine council essentially begged him to come back. When he returned, Cosimo didn't engage in mass executions. That's too messy. He just quietly made sure that all his enemies were either exiled or financially ruined. He didn't want their blood. He just wanted them to stop breathing the same Florentine air as him. The weirdness of Renaissance patronage. The patronage that the Medici engaged in is what we now call the Renaissance, but at the time, it was just their way of dealing with God and public relations. They weren't funding magnificent, expensive projects like Brunelleschi's famous dome of the Florence Cathedral just because they were enlightened visionaries. They were funding it because God. They were terrified of going to hell for the sin of usury, banking. So they figured if they poured massive amounts of money into churches, altarpieces, and pious foundations, God might forgive their slightly dubious financial practices. It was a giant spiritual insurance policy. Reputation. In a competitive city, building the biggest, most beautiful, and most famous dome, or commissioning the most revered statue, like Donatello's David, was simply the best advertisement for your family's wealth and power. It was the 15th century equivalent of buying the naming rights to a stadium. The art itself was often dictated by the whims of the person paying the bills. Cosimo, being a quiet scholar, preferred art that was subtle and intellectual. His grandson, Lorenzo the Magnificent, would demand art that was flamboyant, sexy, and often deeply self-aggrandizing. The lives of the artists were equally chaotic. They weren't treated like highly revered geniuses. They were often treated like highly skilled, slightly flaky, self-employed tradesmen. Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci were constantly chasing patrons for payment, dealing with awkward commissions, and often having to leave town quickly when they upset the wrong banking family. This entire explosion of artistic genius was therefore fueled not by some sudden philosophical shift, but by a combination of capitalist guilt, banking rivalry, and the specific idiosyncratic tastes of a few extremely rich people. Piero the Goody and the Pazzi conspiracy. Cosimo the Elder eventually died, having managed to keep control of Florence for 30 years without ever holding a title higher than citizen. When he died, the Florentine council gave him the honorific title Pater Patriae, Father of the Country. He was succeeded by his son, Piero de' Medici, who had the absolutely spectacular nickname Piero the Goody. Yes, that's right. The heir to the most powerful family in Europe was named after a painful joint condition. Piero was constantly ill and in pain, which meant he was terrible at the daily, constant schmoozing and manipulation required to maintain control of Florence. He was perpetually confined to his bed. This weakness was immediately seized upon by the rivals, of course. When Piero died after only 5 years, the reins of the massive banking state passed to his 2 sons, the magnificent, charismatic Lorenzo and the quiet, pious Giuliano. Lorenzo de' Medici, who history remembers as Lorenzo the Magnificent, was the high point of the Medici dynasty. He was handsome, a gifted poet, a sharp politician, and he threw the best parties. He essentially turned Florence into a permanent hedonistic art festival. But their power bred intense resentment, particularly from the Pazzi family,
another powerful banking rival, who felt the Medici had become too arrogant. And this brings us to one of the most brutal, embarrassing, and public acts of attempted dynastic assassination in the Renaissance: the Pazzi conspiracy of 1478. The Pazzi, backed by the Pope Sixtus IV, who hated the Medici, planned to murder Lorenzo and Giuliano during High Mass on Easter Sunday inside the Florence Cathedral. This is absolutely insane plan, right? Murdering the rulers of the city during church on the holiest day of the year. The assassins, being professional killers, realized the initial plan to poison them at a banquet wouldn't work, so they switched to stabbing them during the raising of the host. The signal for the attack would be the exact moment the...
Find that comfortable spot and let the hum of the Renaissance chaos gently settle your mind. We left Florence, the city of quiet, rich bankers, and now we need to float over to the even messier center of the Italian world, Rome, and the spectacular, high-stakes dysfunction of the Renaissance papacy. If the Medici were controlling Florence by perfecting financial subtlety, the popes of this era were controlling Rome by perfecting outright spectacular corruption, nepotism, and self-aggrandizement. The popes weren't just spiritual leaders anymore. They were major Italian princes and warlords, from fisherman to warlord. In the 15th century, the papacy needed to rebuild its temporal power, meaning their control over the papal states, the large territory in central Italy they claimed. And the quickest way to do that? Nepotism. The popes of this era, almost to a man, saw their office not as a spiritual calling, but as an opportunity to enrich and empower their own family, the pope's family. These relatives were known as nephews, nipoti, even if they were actual sons, which of course many of them were, despite the church's vows of celibacy. A pope would get elected, and his immediate priority was to award every important, lucrative, and politically powerful position, cardinal, bishop, governor, to his brothers, sons, nephews, and cousins. This created these temporary, power-mad papal dynasties that would last as long as the pope himself did, leading to absolute chaos every time an old pope died. We're going to focus on the family that epitomizes this spectacular, deadly self-dealing: the Borgias. Rodrigo Borgia, the ultimate career climber. Our main character here is Rodrigo Borgia, a Spaniard who had climbed the church hierarchy using charm, political maneuvering, and a dazzling lack of moral restraint. He started his career thanks to his uncle, Pope Calixtus III, who made him a cardinal. By the time the papal conclave met in 1492 to elect the next pope, Rodrigo was already one of the richest men in Rome. He didn't win the election through divine inspiration. He won it through straight-up bribery. He leveraged his immense wealth, promising huge payments, palaces, and high offices to the other cardinals in exchange for their votes. Rodrigo Borgia was elected pope and took the name Alexander VI. Alexander VI was famously handsome, charismatic, and completely focused on secular power. He had several children, unapologetically, even as a cardinal. But upon becoming pope, his focus shifted entirely to the dynastic promotion of his 4 children, particularly his 2 youngest, Cesare and Lucrezia. His goal was simple: use the papal power and papal armies to carve out permanent hereditary kingdoms for his children within Italy. He treated the papacy like a massive personal corporation. Cesare Borgia, the Prince of Papal War. Cesare Borgia is arguably the most fascinating, terrifying, and effective of the Borgias. Alexander VI's ambition for Cesare was boundless. First, he made Cesare an archbishop, then a cardinal. But Cesare, a man who preferred war and women to theology, soon grew tired of the clerical robes. In a truly unprecedented move in 1498, Cesare resigned his cardinality. He literally walked away from the highest rank in the church to become a military commander. He was the first person in history to voluntarily resign the office of cardinal, and his father, the Pope, allowed it, because why not double down on the family business? Cesare was tall, incredibly strong, and completely ruthless. He became the Duke of Valentinois, a title granted by the King of France, and his papal-funded army began a massive, brutal campaign to conquer the fragmented territories of the Papal States in central Italy. Cesare was a brilliant military strategist. He was famous for his speed, his decisive cruelty, and his willingness to use political assassination to eliminate rivals. The stories are everywhere, and whether entirely true or slightly exaggerated, they cemented the Borgia name in history. Rivals disappearing, banquets ending in death by poisoning, and enemies found strangled in the Tiber River. The popular image of the Borgias using poison, often via the famous untraceable cantarella, believed to be arsenic, became their brand. Cesare became the terror of Italy. He was the ultimate embodiment of the new Renaissance prince, efficient, Machiavellian, and completely amoral. Indeed, Cesare Borgia was the direct, primary inspiration for Niccolò Machiavelli's famous political treatise, The Prince. Machiavelli studied Cesare close up and concluded that this cold, pragmatic cruelty was the only way to effectively rule a volatile state. Then there's Lucrezia Borgia, Alexander VI's daughter, who was used as a key piece of dynastic strategy. She was married off 3 times before the age of 21. Her marriages were not about love or partnership. They were political mergers, often short-lived and always focused on advancing the Borgia power base. Her first 2 husbands were politically inconvenient and ended poorly. The first, Giovanni Sforza, was divorced quickly when the alliance became useless. The second, Alfonso of Aragon, was a threat to Cesare's shifting alliance with France. Alfonso was eventually murdered. The fact that her second husband was likely strangled by Cesare's hitmen, probably while recovering from an earlier failed assassination attempt, didn't seem to slow Lucrezia down too much. She went on to marry Alfonso d'Este, Duke of Ferrara, and she settled down to become a respectable, if famously powerful patron of the arts. Her personal tragedy is that she was utterly disposable to her father and brother. She was simply a beautiful, well-connected asset to be traded or discarded as the political fortunes of the Borgia family required. The inevitable fall. The Borgia dynasty, based on bribery and bloodshed, was completely dependent on the life of Alexander VI. In August 1503, both Alexander VI and Cesare Borgia suddenly fell violently ill. It was probably malaria, which was common in the Roman summer. But of course, everyone at the time assumed they were poisoned, possibly even by an ill-prepared drink that was meant for someone else. Alexander VI died quickly. Cesare, younger and stronger, survived the illness, but the Pope's death instantly shattered his vast power structure. The moment his father died, Cesare's armies dissolved, his political alliances evaporated, and his enemies rose up. Cesare had failed to secure the succession, and his carefully constructed military state collapsed overnight. He was captured, imprisoned, and eventually died fighting as a mercenary in Spain a few years later. The Borgia name, which had terrified Italy for a decade, vanished from power almost instantly. This is the great, sleepy lesson of the Renaissance popes. They prioritized their families over the church, and in doing so, they created spectacular personal power, but completely failed to create any lasting stability. They were brilliant at being princes, but terrible at making dynasties. Let's gently transition away from the popes and the assassins, and float over to the even richer, if slightly less blood-stained Renaissance center of the North, Venice. I have completed part 2, focusing on the Renaissance papacy, the rise of Alexander VI through bribery, the ruthlessness of Cesare Borgia, the use of Lucrezia as a political asset, and the eventual, abrupt collapse of the dynasty.
Take a moment to stretch your neck, and let's leave the blood-soaked Pope-run chaos of Rome and gently drift north and east to the third great power of the Italian Renaissance, Venice. If Florence was controlled by bankers and Rome by ambitious warlord popes, Venice was controlled by merchants. and they did everything differently. Venice was known as La Serenissima, the most serene republic. They valued stability, secrecy, and silk more than they valued individual charismatic power. The problem with water? Venice was built on the sea, which was both its greatest strength and its most profound vulnerability. It was a trading empire built on salt, spices, and the ability to fight off anyone who tried to interfere with their trade routes. But Venice was also entirely dependent on a delicate, almost insane bureaucratic system to function. The entire government structure was designed with one paranoid goal in mind: preventing any single person from ever gaining absolute power. They saw what happened in Florence, the Medici, and Rome, the Borgias, and they said, "No thank you. We'll take stability over magnificent tyranny." The head of state was the Doge. The title sounds very grand, like a king or prince, but it was, ironically, the ultimate trap. The Doge was elected for life, and he was elected from the ranks of the powerful merchant elite. But the election process was a masterpiece of Venetian bureaucracy. It involved a completely absurd series of lotteries and votes, requiring 30 separate steps and taking weeks to complete. It was so complicated that nobody could possibly bribe or rig the process entirely. The golden cage of the Doge. Once elected, the Doge was immediately stripped of nearly all personal authority. He lived in the stunning Doge's palace, a masterpiece of Gothic architecture, dressed in unbelievably rich robes and the distinctive large horn-shaped cap, corno ducale. He was the supreme symbol of Venetian power, but he was a king in a golden cage. The government immediately assigned the Doge 2 official minders who were required to accompany him everywhere. He couldn't open his own mail. He couldn't leave the city without government permission. He couldn't accept gifts. If he even spoke to a foreign ambassador alone, it was considered an act of treason. His family members were forbidden from holding any significant office to prevent the start of a dynasty. The moment he died, his estate was audited to make sure he hadn't used his office to enrich his family. If he had, the state actually had the right to seize the illicit wealth after his death. The life of a Doge was thus a slow, quiet, humiliating bureaucratic ritual. He had the best view in the city, the finest clothes, and the most public honor, but zero personal freedom. It was a deliberate institutional choice. Venice wanted a symbol, not a leader. They wanted the stability of a single figurehead without the terror of an absolute ruler. The Council of Ten, the quiet terror. The real power in Venice lay not with the Doge, but with a series of interlocking, overlapping councils, particularly the powerful and secretive Council of Ten, Consiglio dei Dieci. The Council of Ten was essentially the state security apparatus and the High Court rolled into one. They operated in absolute secrecy. If someone was accused of treason, conspiracy, or corruption, they were investigated, tried, and sometimes executed, all without public knowledge. The Ten could, and often did, use assassination and espionage to maintain Venice's commercial interests abroad. This secrecy, combined with the lack of any single figurehead to blame, meant that the terrifying stability of Venice was guaranteed. There were no messy public executions of rival bankers like in Florence, or spectacular bloody rampages like Cesare Borgias. The chaos was simply handled privately, quickly, and with maximum efficiency. Venice was terrifyingly serene. The Venetian Meltdown, the fall of the Republic. For centuries, this intricate system worked perfectly. Venice became one of the longest-lived republics in history, known for its wealth,
its beauty, and its absolute lack of drama. But the Renaissance world, fueled by exploration and new trade routes, was changing around them. The moment that signaled the slow, inevitable doom of Venice was the discovery of a sea route to India around Africa by the Portuguese explorer Vasco da Gama in 1498. Before this, all the lucrative Asian spice trade had to flow through the Mediterranean, which meant it went through Venice. They had a near monopoly. But once the Portuguese figured out how to go around Africa, the spice trade started to flow directly to the ports of the Atlantic. The slow decline of Venice was a slow tragedy of stubbornness. The Venetian elite were so convinced of their traditional trading superiority that they failed to adapt to the new Atlantic-focused global economy. They kept their rigid political structure, they kept their elaborate silk robes, and they kept their secret councils, but the money began to dry up. The final sleep-inducing irony of Venice is that after nearly 1,000 years of fiercely guarded independence and stability, their elaborate anti-tyrannical republic was finally ended not by a bloody coup, or a war, or a greedy pope, but by Napoleon Bonaparte in 1797. Napoleon simply marched into the city, demanded the Doge abdicate, and the last Doge, a man named Ludovico Manin, simply complied, handing over the keys to the most serene republic without a fight. When he took off his distinctive Doge's cap, he reportedly complained that his head hurt. The 1,000-year-old republic ended not with a bang, but with a headache. That's the core of the Renaissance power centers. Florence, money, ego, and art. Rome, God, poison, and spectacle. And Venice, secrecy, silk, and a very boring figurehead. Let's now gently transition away from the political structures and float over to the artistic geniuses they paid for, focusing on the awkward personal lives of Leonardo and Michelangelo. I have completed part 3, detailing the political structure of Venice, the role and restrictions of the Doge, the power of the Council of Ten, and the slow, ironic economic decline of the Republic.
We've looked at the rich and the ruthless, the bankers, the popes, and the silk merchants who paid for the Renaissance. Now let's float over to the people they actually hired, the artists. We remember them as flawless geniuses, but in real life, the Renaissance masters were often awkward, financially messy, deeply neurotic, and constantly complaining about their clients. We're going to focus on the two biggest names because their rivalry and their personal oddities are peak Renaissance dysfunction. Leonardo da Vinci, the unfocused polymath. Let's start with Leonardo da Vinci. We know him as the master painter, inventor, scientist, and philosopher. But if you were a patron hiring Leonardo, you would probably describe him as a brilliant, expensive flake. The thing about Leonardo is that he was incredibly easily distracted. He was the ultimate polymath, which meant he was always starting new projects but rarely finishing them. He was interested in everything: how birds fly, how water moves, how the human body works, and how to invent a gigantic crossbow. If you gave him a commission to paint a major altarpiece, he might spend 6 months researching the exact properties of the oil pigments, another 6 months dissecting human cadavers to understand muscle structure, and then maybe, just maybe, he'd get around to putting a few sketches on the canvas. His patrons constantly complained. Think about his most famous unfinished work, The Adoration of the Magi. He was commissioned to paint it in 1481, but he left Florence shortly after and never finished it. It remains a magnificent, brown, highly detailed underdrawing. The Mona Lisa, arguably the most famous painting in the world, was a commission that he kept with him for years, constantly tinkering with it, and possibly never delivered to the man who actually commissioned it, Francesco del Giocondo. He simply liked the painting and kept it around. Leonardo's personal life was just as unusual and quietly chaotic. Fashion, he loved to dress extravagantly, favoring short, brightly colored velvet tunics that were considered old-fashioned and a bit ridiculous for a man his age. Writing? He was famously a left-hander who wrote backward in mirror writing to protect his ideas. Or maybe he just found it more comfortable. It certainly makes you wonder how his assistants dealt with his notes on fluid dynamics. Money? Despite working for popes, kings, and the powerful Duke of Milan, Ludovico Sforza, Leonardo was always terrible with money. He was constantly overspending, borrowing, and leaving projects incomplete, which meant he frequently had to pick up and move to a new city to find a new patient patron. The greatest irony of Leonardo da Vinci is that he was a genius driven by an almost paralyzing perfectionism and a total lack of focus. He left the world hundreds of notebooks full of incredible ideas and detailed anatomical drawings, but a surprisingly small number of finished, complete paintings. He was the ultimate Renaissance procrastinator. Michelangelo Buonarroti, the miserable sculptor. Now, let's look at the only person who could possibly compete with Leonardo. If Leonardo was distracted and flighty, Michelangelo was singularly focused, intensely gloomy, and perpetually angry. He was the ultimate antisocial genius. He rarely bathed, slept in his clothes, and was known for his bad temper and profound self-pity. He hated almost everyone, especially his patrons. He viewed painting as a slightly inferior art form. He considered himself a sculptor first and foremost, and he deeply resented being forced to paint, particularly the greatest painting commission of the Renaissance, the Sistine Chapel ceiling. In 1508, Pope Julius II hired Michelangelo to paint the ceiling. The job was colossal, physically grueling, and completely outside his comfort zone. Michelangelo famously complained about the Pope, the pay, and the impossible angle he had to lie in for 4 years, dripping paint in his eyes. He wrote a famously miserable poem about the experience, detailing his cramped neck and the paint that had solidified his beard. He didn't just hate the work, he hated his rivals. His rivalry with Leonardo was famous. They absolutely detested each other, constantly sniping and competing for commissions, particularly their disastrous simultaneous commissions for large battle frescoes in the Great Council Hall of Florence. Neither fresco was ever finished, of course. Leonardo's because he tried a terrible experimental paint, and Michelangelo's because he got called away by the Pope. But the saddest and most awkward thing about Michelangelo was his relationship with his family and his money. Despite being one of the highest paid artists in history, he lived like a pauper. He was completely obsessed with money, but only for the purpose of sending vast sums back to his family in Florence, whom he supported his entire life. He bought them houses, property, and businesses, but treated them with an almost paranoid contempt, constantly complaining in his letters that they were lazy, incompetent, and were just waiting for him to die. He was a millionaire who dressed in rags and ate poorly, driven by a deep, unrelenting sense of duty and a pervasive, quiet misery. He carved the most beautiful, idealized human figures in history, yet he himself lived a life of total, self-imposed deprivation and emotional isolation. The ironic contrast is perfect. The Renaissance was a rebirth of humanism and beauty, but its two greatest stars were a rich, handsome, charming genius who couldn't finish anything, and a rich, profoundly unhappy miser who hated his work. Let's transition away from the artists and float gently down to the common, terrible fate that often awaited their rich, noble clients, focusing on the dark side of Renaissance medicine and disease.
All right, if you're still comfortable, let's leave the cold, paint-splattered misery of the artists and float over to the even grimmer realities that awaited the powerful people who hired them. We've talked about the wealth, the art, and the political power, but the constant underlying reality of the Renaissance was death. The rich might have commissioned beautiful frescoes, but they lived in a perpetual state of poor health, questionable hygiene, and completely insane medical practices. Life expectancy, even for the wealthy elite, was still shockingly low,
and children frequently died before reaching adulthood. The problem with Renaissance hygiene. When we look at those glorious paintings of velvet robes and polished marble, we rarely consider the level of filth that permeated daily life. The concept of personal hygiene was, shall we say, optional. Bathing was considered risky, especially in the cold north, and sometimes even believed to open the pores to disease. Instead of regular washing, the aristocracy relied heavily on perfume to mask the overwhelming smells of unwashed bodies and unemptied chamber pots. The amount of perfume used in a single Renaissance court could likely choke a small horse. Houses, even palaces, were often structurally beautiful but functionally filthy. Sewage disposal was haphazard at best. Waste was often simply dumped into the streets or courtyards, where it mixed with market refuse and the general grime of the city. You might commission a beautiful Botticelli painting in your villa, only to step over a pile of refuse on your way to admire it. The silent killer, syphilis. While the plague was still a recurring terror, the great new disease of the Renaissance, the one that really scared and embarrassed the elite, was syphilis. Syphilis is believed to have arrived in Europe around the time of the French invasion of Naples in 1494, and it immediately spread through the armies, and then into the royal and aristocratic families. Because it often caused grotesque sores, hair loss, and eventual madness, it was both deadly and utterly humiliating. The irony here is beautiful. The Renaissance celebrated the perfect human form, all those magnificent muscled statues and paintings, while the elites funding the art were simultaneously being ravaged by a disease that completely destroyed the body. The disease was often treated with massive, highly toxic doses of mercury. Yes, mercury. Patients would be made to sit in mercury steam baths or rub mercury compounds onto their sores. This treatment, of course, caused terrible side effects, including neurological damage, delirium, and often death. So you might die, or you might survive with severe brain damage, but either way, the treatment was arguably worse than the disease itself. The madness of Renaissance medicine. The medical system itself was a strange blend of ancient Greek ideas, Galen, and medieval superstition. Doctors were often highly educated, but completely lacking in any effective treatments. They believed the body was governed by the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. If you were sick, it meant your humors were out of balance. The treatments were often designed to violently expel the excess humor. Bleeding was the most common treatment. If you had a fever, you had too much blood, so a doctor would cut you open or apply leeches until you bled out a certain amount. This naturally weakened an already sick patient and often sped up the dying process. Purging, or laxatives, if the problem was bile, you were given powerful laxatives or forced to vomit violently. Complex potions. A doctor might prescribe a potion made of ground pearls, pulverized mummies, yes, real mummies, or animal extracts, all stirred into wine. These were expensive, impressive, and completely useless. We can see the grim results of this in the life of Cosimo I de' Medici, the first official Grand Duke of Tuscany. Cosimo I was a powerful, successful ruler, but his health in later life was a tragedy of Renaissance medicine. He was constantly afflicted with debilitating illness and was perpetually subjected to aggressive treatments. At one point, his doctor prescribed him 36 aggressive bleedings over the course of just a few months. He died slowly, painfully, and probably hastened by the constant medical intervention. Another example is Pope Leo X, Giovanni de' Medici, Lorenzo the Magnificent's son. He was a great patron who loved hunting and feasting. He was plagued by painful fistulas, an abscess near the anus, a common affliction of the rich and gluttonous. His doctors would repeatedly cut and cauterize the area. When he finally died suddenly in 1521, his demise was so unexpected that many immediately assumed he was poisoned, because natural death seemed too simple and anticlimactic for a Renaissance pope. The great awkwardness of death. Death, when it finally arrived, was a huge public religious spectacle. Dying was a social obligation. The rich would gather their family, their priests, and often their friends to witness the process. Priests were constantly whispering promises of salvation and warnings of damnation. The irony is that all the money, all the political power, and all the genius art that the Renaissance produced could not buy these people an extra year of healthy life, nor could it buy them competent medical care. They lived in a magnificent, glittering age of rediscovery, but they died just as their medieval ancestors did, slowly, painfully, and often assisted by a well-intentioned but utterly destructive physician convinced that a few more leeches would solve the problem. Let's let that reality, the smell of perfume masking disease, the fear of mercury, and the constant dread of an untimely death gently drift you further into this historical landscape. Next time, we'll float away from Italy to look at the new ideas emerging in the North and the final awkward, violent moments of the Renaissance, focusing on the Reformation and the rise of Martin Luther. I have completed Part 5, detailing the grim reality of hygiene, the terrifying spread and treatment of syphilis, and the ineffectiveness of humoral medicine maintaining the required tone.
Take a moment, settle back, and let's shift our focus completely. We're leaving the sun-drenched, plague-ridden chaos of Italy and moving north to the cold, religiously anxious world of Germany. The Renaissance popes and their banking families were busy commissioning art to buy their way out of hell. But up north, a completely different movement was brewing that would utterly shatter the financial and religious system the Medici had so cleverly monetized. We're talking about the Reformation and its awkward, intense, and surprisingly charming figurehead, Martin Luther. The anxious monk. Martin Luther was not some ambitious prince or charismatic orator. He was an Augustinian monk and a professor of theology at the University of Wittenberg. He was a small, intense, and deeply anxious man who was obsessed with the question of salvation. For years, Luther struggled with the terrifying doctrine of the Catholic Church that salvation was earned through a combination of faith and good works, things like going to Mass, doing penance, and avoiding sin. Luther felt that no matter how hard he tried, he could never be good enough to satisfy a righteous God. He lived in a state of constant, paralyzing religious anxiety. His personal breakthrough, which formed the core of the Reformation, was simple and quiet. He concluded that salvation came through faith alone, sola fide. God's grace was a free gift. You couldn't buy it, and you couldn't earn it. You just had to accept it. Now, this seems like a nice, harmless theological distinction, but it had immediate, disastrous financial consequences for the entire Catholic Church, which was built on the idea that you could buy grace. The indulgences scam. The key element that finally pushed Luther from academic anxiety to public protest was the utterly crass, spectacular fundraising scheme developed by the papacy, indulgences. An indulgence was essentially a certificate signed by the Pope that promised to reduce the time your soul or the soul of a deceased relative would have to spend in purgatory, that holding area between earth and heaven. It was a literal spiritual get-out-of-jail-free card. In the early 16th century, Pope Leo X, Lorenzo de' Medici's son, remember him, was raising massive amounts of money to complete the construction of the new magnificent St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. To fund this, he authorized the sale of a truly aggressive new indulgence campaign across Europe. The traveling salesman for this spiritual product in Germany was a Dominican friar named Johann Tetzel.
Tetzel was a brilliant, theatrical, and utterly shameless marketer. His sales pitch was famously simple and catchy. As soon as the coin and the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs. Luther, watching Tetzel set up shop near Wittenberg, was utterly horrified. To him, this wasn't just corruption, it was a total theological lie. If salvation came only through faith, then selling these certificates was giving people false hope and undermining the true path to God. The 95 Theses and the Power of Print. On October 31st, 1517, in what is now the highly romanticized start of the Reformation, Luther supposedly nailed his 95 Theses, a list of scholarly propositions for debate, to the door of the Wittenberg Castle Church. The debate over whether he actually nailed them or simply mailed them to the archbishop is a cozy bit of historical controversy, but the effect was immediate and overwhelming, thanks to a technology that was itself a product of the late Renaissance, the printing press. Before the printing press, distributing a 95-point document would have taken weeks or months for scribes to copy by hand, and it would have remained an academic curiosity. But with the printing press, Luther's theses were instantly translated from Latin into German, printed and distributed across the Holy Roman Empire in a matter of weeks. This was the first true mass media event in European history. Suddenly, common people, merchants, peasants, city dwellers, were reading a critique of the Pope's financial scheme. The printing press stripped the Church of its monopoly on information. Luther was not just debating a theological point, he was giving the public the script to understand how they were being financially exploited by an Italian pope. The popes, naturally, did not like this. They tried to handle Luther as a minor academic annoyance. Pope Leo X initially dismissed the whole thing as the babblings of a drunken German. But when Luther kept writing, producing brilliant, short, fiery pamphlets, which the printers loved, the papacy realized they had a real problem. They issued a papal bull, or formal decree, demanding Luther recant or be excommunicated. Luther responded with trademark dry defiance. He publicly gathered a crowd and burned the papal bull. The final confrontation came at the Diet of Worms, or 1521, a formal imperial assembly presided over by the young Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. Luther was summoned and asked one final time to recant his writings. In a famously quiet and resolute moment, Luther gave his answer. "Unless I am convinced by the testimony of the Scriptures or by clear reason, for I do not trust in either the Pope or in councils alone, since it is well known that they have often erred and contradicted themselves, I am bound by the Scriptures I have quoted, and my conscience is captive to the Word of God. I cannot and will not retract anything, since it is neither safe nor right to go against conscience. May God help me. Amen." That statement, the quiet assertion that a man's individual conscience, informed by the Bible, was superior to the collective authority of the Church and the Empire, was the ultimate, defiant expression of Renaissance individualism, stripped of the velvet and gold. Luther was declared a heretic and an outlaw, but his powerful local protector, Frederick the Wise, the Elector of Saxony, orchestrated a completely fake kidnapping and hid Luther away in the remote Wartburg Castle. Luther spent his time there, disguised as a knight named Junker Jorg, translating the Bible into common German, another revolutionary act that took religious interpretation out of the hands of the clergy and gave it directly to the people, thanks again to the printing press. The Reformation was now unstoppable, and it did far more to end the unified religious vision of Europe than any amount of art or philosophy ever could. The money flow to Rome was cut off, the political structure of Germany was thrown into civil war, and the quiet authority of the popes was irrevocably broken. Let's let that revolutionary sound of the printing press quietly echo for a moment. and then we'll float over to the even more chaotic world of the Northern Renaissance, focusing on the ultimate political monster of the age, Henry VIII.
All right, let's gently cross the channel and float over to England, where the Reformation took a completely different and far more personally motivated turn. We're going to talk about Henry VIII, a man who managed to accidentally destroy 800 years of religious tradition, all because he was obsessed with having a son. Henry VIII, the Renaissance man with a terrible temper. Henry VIII started his reign in 1509 as the perfect Renaissance prince. He was handsome, athletic, charming, a talented musician, spoke several languages, and was deeply devoted to the Catholic Church. He even wrote a pamphlet attacking Martin Luther, earning the title Defender of the Faith from the Pope. Of course, he lost that title later, which is peak historical irony. The problem with Henry was his ego and his singular dynastic need for a male heir. He was terrified that his family, the Tudors, who were only recently established on the throne after decades of civil war, would lose power if he died without a son. His wife was Catherine of Aragon, the Spanish princess and aunt of the powerful Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. She was dignified, intelligent, and fiercely royal. She gave Henry a daughter, Mary, but after years of miscarriages and stillbirths, it became clear she would likely not bear a living son. Henry became absolutely convinced that his marriage was cursed by God. He argued that marrying his deceased brother Arthur's widow was forbidden by the Bible, and God was punishing him by denying him a male heir. He decided he needed an annulment, a fancy way of saying this marriage never happened. The Great Matter, an awkward legal battle. This entire crisis, which consumed England for a decade, was known as the King's Great Matter. Henry turned to Pope Clement VII, another Medici cousin, because the papacy was always entangled with the great families, for the annulment. Henry's legal argument was complex, but the political situation was simple. Pope Clement VII was, at that exact moment, effectively a prisoner of Catherine of Aragon's nephew, Charles V. The Pope was trapped. If he granted the annulment, he would utterly humiliate Charles V, who was his captor and the most powerful man in Europe. If he refused, he would lose England. He did what any good politician would do when faced with a catastrophic decision. He stalled. He stalled for years. Henry VIII, a man used to getting exactly what he wanted, found the papal bureaucracy and indecision absolutely intolerable. Meanwhile, he had fallen completely in love with Anne Boleyn, a witty, sophisticated lady-in-waiting who refused to simply be his mistress. She demanded the crown. The Accidental Revolution. The stalling finally ended in 1533, and it was engineered by Henry's brilliant, ruthlessly, and ultimately doomed chief minister, Thomas Cromwell. Cromwell realized they could skip the papacy entirely. Cromwell convinced Henry to declare himself the supreme head of the church in England. This was done through the Act of Supremacy in 1534. The act simply stated that the king, not the pope, was the head of the church in his own country. This wasn't initially a theological revolution like Luther's. It was a pure political divorce. Henry didn't want to change the liturgy or the doctrine. He still hated Luther. He just wanted to change the pope. The consequences, however, were revolutionary. Annulment granted. Henry's new Archbishop of Canterbury, Tallis Cranmer, immediately granted the annulment, and Henry married the already pregnant Anne Boleyn. The dissolution of the monasteries. This was Cromwell's financial genius. The church owned an enormous amount of land in England, primarily the monasteries. Cromwell dissolved the monasteries, confiscated all their massive wealth and land, and sold it off. This poured vast sums into the king's treasury, securing Henry's power and creating a new class of wealthy landowners who were financially invested in the split with Rome. This move was a brutal, systematic act of cultural vandalism. Hundreds of ancient buildings were destroyed, their libraries burned, and their religious communities scattered, all to pay for Henry's lavish lifestyle and his wars. The tyranny of the wives. Henry's victory was immediate, but his pursuit of a male heir was an ongoing, traumatic disaster. Anne Boleyn gave him a daughter, Elizabeth, who would become one of England's greatest monarchs, but no son. Henry, convinced she was another punishment from God, fabricated charges of incest and treason against her. She was executed in 1536, a truly unprecedented act of political cruelty against a queen. He immediately married Jane Seymour, who finally gave him his desperately sought-after son, Edward. Jane died shortly after birth. Then came the disastrous, politically motivated marriage to Anne of Cleves, who Henry found deeply unattractive, famously saying she looked like a Flanders mare. Cromwell, who arranged the marriage, was soon executed for this political misstep. He married Catherine Howard, a young, frivolous cousin of Anne Boleyn. She was executed for adultery. Finally, he settled on the sensible and capable Catherine Parr, who outlived him. By the time Henry died in 1477, he was morbidly obese, racked with disease, likely syphilis and gout, and utterly paranoid. He had executed 2 wives, 2 chief ministers, and numerous friends and political rivals. He had torn apart the religious fabric of his country, not for theological reasons, but simply because he needed an heir and the Pope wouldn't cooperate. The result was a religious and political time bomb. The English Church was stuck in a messy middle ground, Catholic in ritual, but headed by the king. The succession was unstable. First his sickly son Edward VI, then his Catholic daughter Mary I, who tried to violently reverse the Reformation, and finally his Protestant daughter Elizabeth I, who restored the peace. Henry VIII is the perfect, terrifying example of how personal, psychological obsession, the need for a son, combined with political opportunity, the Reformation, can lead to complete, unintentional, and irreversible historical upheaval.
All right, let's settle back in. We've seen the Renaissance in all its messy glory. The wealth, the genius, the political corruption, and the crippling hypocrisy of its medical practices. We've also seen how Martin Luther and Henry VIII, for completely different reasons, shattered the religious unity of Europe. Now, we must float through the terrifying, unavoidable aftermath, the religious wars that consumed the mid to late Renaissance and definitively ended the era of shared European culture. The theological arguments that started in lecture halls and printing presses quickly turned into brutal, low-level military slaughter. The core problem was that after Luther, there were 2 official versions of Christianity, Catholicism and Protestantism, or Lutheranism, Calvinism, etc., and both sides believed the other was following a path to eternal damnation. This wasn't a political disagreement, it was an existential threat. The first immediate fallout was in the Holy Roman Empire, roughly modern Germany. The local princes, who hated paying taxes to the Pope anyway, eagerly adopted Lutheranism, which allowed them to seize the wealth of the Catholic Church in their territories. This led to decades of internal conflicts, eventually settled, temporarily, by the Peace of Augsburg, 1555, which had the wonderfully awkward principle, cuius regio, eius religio, whose realm, his religion. Essentially, if your prince was Lutheran, you were Lutheran. If he was Catholic,
you were Catholic. If you disagreed, you packed up and moved. It was a bureaucratic solution to a spiritual crisis, and naturally, it was deeply unstable. France, the Huguenot horror show. The religious wars reached their most brutal, chaotic, and spectacular level of incompetence in France. The French crown was staunchly Catholic, but a significant portion of the nobility, particularly the Bourbon family, had converted to Calvinism, Protestantism, giving them the nickname Huguenots. This wasn't just a religious schism, it was a civil war driven by powerful, competing noble families. For decades, France was racked by low-grade, messy conflicts. The entire fragile situation came to a head in 1572 with the wedding of the king's Catholic sister, Margaret of Valois, to the leading Huguenot prince, Henry of Navarre. This wedding was supposed to be a grand gesture of peace and reconciliation. Instead, it became the setup for one of the most gruesome, politically cynical massacres in the Renaissance, the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre. A few days after the wedding, a powerful Catholic nobleman was attacked in the street, likely on the orders of the king's mother, the manipulative Catherine de' Medici, a distant cousin of the Florentine family. Fearing Huguenot retaliation, Catherine and the young King Charles IX convinced themselves that the Huguenot leaders gathered for the wedding were plotting a coup. Charles IX, a nervous and sickly young man, was supposedly pushed to consent to a preemptive strike, famously saying, "Well then, kill them all so that no man is left to reproach me." On the night of August 24th, 1572, the massacre began. The French royal guard and Catholic mobs, identified by white armbands, systematically hunted down and murdered the Huguenot leaders and nobles who were still in Paris for the wedding. The violence quickly spread to the general population. The sound of the bells of Saint-Germain-Auxerrois, ringing in the dead of night, became the signal to murder. The violence spilled out of Paris into the provincial towns. The killing lasted for weeks. Estimates vary wildly, but perhaps 5,000 to 30,000 people were murdered across France. This was not a quick, clean assassination. It was a total breakdown of civil order, sanctioned by the state. The immediate effect was not stability, but total chaos. Henry of Navarre, the Huguenot groom, was forced to convert to Catholicism to save his life. The Renaissance ideals of humanism, rational thought, and peace were utterly drowned in sectarian blood. The Spanish Fury and the decline of Italy. While France tore itself apart, the powerful, highly Catholic Spanish Empire under King Philip II was fighting a protracted, vicious war to suppress the Protestant revolt in the Netherlands, modern Belgium and Holland. This was a long, expensive, and brutal war that saw Spanish troops fighting far from home. A particularly messy moment occurred in 1576, known as the Spanish Fury. Spanish soldiers, who had not been paid for months, a classic logistical failure, mutinied and unleashed a spectacular rampage of looting, murder, and arson on the city of Antwerp. This confirmed every negative stereotype about the Spanish soldiers and permanently alienated the Dutch provinces. Back in Italy, the Catholic Church responded to the Reformation with its own slow, institutional awakening, the Counter-Reformation. This wasn't a rebirth of art, but a rebirth of rigid control. The Church cracked down on corruption, reaffirmed its doctrines at the Council of Trent, and established the Roman Inquisition. The Inquisition was a terrifying bureaucratic machine designed to root out heresy. It was less focused on mass executions than on meticulous record-keeping, psychological pressure, and ensuring absolute conformity to Catholic dogma. The spirit of liberal inquiry that defined the Renaissance was replaced by the spirit of orthodoxy and censorship. The sleepy conclusion of an era. The religious wars weren't one big conflict. They were dozens of localized, messy, and cruel civil wars that raged across Europe for nearly a century. They showed that when faced with a fundamental disagreement about the nature of God, The elegant philosophical ideals of the Renaissance would be dropped immediately in favor of a sword and a paranoid mob. The genius art continued for a time. Michelangelo died in 1564, long into this age of chaos, but the cultural, intellectual, and political landscape had fundamentally changed. The unity was gone. The optimism was gone. The belief in man's perfectibility was replaced by a grim conviction of man's depravity. The Renaissance ended not with a single date, but when the people who were supposed to be the leaders, kings, cardinals, and princes, repeatedly chose massacre, religious tyranny, and violence over the humanistic ideals they claimed to cherish. This violent fragmentation paved the way for the next phase of European history, the age of absolutism and the rise of the massive centralized nation-states that tried to use power and order to put an end to the spiritual chaos. So, let's take a final deep breath and let all that grand tragic irony settle. We've covered the entire magnificent and very dysfunctional arc of the Renaissance.